Hi guys! Welcome to our section on rationals word problems. In this section, we'll be covering 3 different types of word problems that have to do with rationals. The first type is ratio word problems. We're going to be using that same map that we use for every kind of word problem. So label, translate, solve and answer. So let's jump right in and take a look at a ratio word problem and what each of those steps will look like. All right, so this is just a quick reminder of what our map should look like when we do these word problems. So if you need a little refresher on what each step should look like, feel free to pause here before we move on, okay? All right, so here's our word problem. It's about cats and dogs. The ratio of cats to dogs at a shelter is 8 to 5. If there are 200 cats, how many dogs are there? Now this one's really nice because it actually says the word ratio inside the problem. So that's like a dead giveaway. Oh, this is a ratio problem. We won't always have problems that are so obvious. So how do you know if it's a ratio word problem and what should you do? Well, you'll know it's a ratio word problem because you'll be comparing two quantities of things. So when you right in this problem, if it didn't say ratio, if it just said, there are cats and dogs at a shelter, oh, I'm comparing cats and dogs. There's my two quantities. You're always going to want to write your ratio in English first, and we'll talk more about that in the next step. And when you're given ratio word problems, they're really nice because you can just use cross multiplication to solve and find the answer. So ratio word problems are actually really nice. They're pretty quick. The hardest part about them is just realizing that it's a ratio word problem because, like I said, it won't always have that word ratio in it. Sometimes you're going to have to stop and think, oh, I'm comparing two quantities here. This must be a ratio problem. And as always, don't forget to include your units at the end, okay? Because your units will either need to be cats or dogs for this, so you're going to have to use whichever unit is appropriate at the end of the problem in your answer. So here's step 1. Step 1 is always label, right? We want to label how many variables? Just one. We only ever want to be solving for one thing. So as always, I'm going to tell you to read the problem 3 times. The first time, just read it. The second time, you're going to circle important words and symbols. So for this problem, I'd probably circle cats to dogs. There's my two quantities. Oh, 8 to 5. I might even put a little C over the 8 and a D over the 5 for dogs so I don't get those confused. And there are 200 cats. And then the last time I read the word problem, I always zoom in on the on what the question is asking me. So I'd probably underline how many dogs are there. Oh, that's what I'm looking for, right? So now I sort of need to figure out what I'm labeling as my variable. So I'm going to think to myself, what two things are being compared? Okay, cats and dogs. And which one of those quantities is missing? Well, it's pretty obvious. It's asking how many dogs are there. So there's my variable right there. I'm looking for how many dogs, right? So let's call the number of dogs in the shelter X. And you could name it any variable. You could have named it D if you wanted, whatever you want to call it. Just give it a variable name. That's my one variable. So now I can move into the translation step. I've labeled my variable. I'm all set. So now we move into step 2, which is the translation step. That's where we take our English sentences and we put them into math equations. All right. So the thing about ratios is you always want to write your ratio in English first. That's incredibly important. Always take the time to do this. And let's look at why. So I'm going to make the decision for my ratio to put cats in the numerator, dogs in the denominator. You could have swapped it. You could have put dogs in the numerator and cats in the denominator. It doesn't matter which you put where to start, as long as you're consistent throughout the problem. And that's why we're writing it in English first, so that we maintain that consistency. So let me show you what I mean, okay? This problem says that the ratio of cats to dogs is 8 to 5. That means for every 8 cats, right, there are 5 dogs, okay? So I'm deciding anytime I'm talking about cats, it's going to go in my numerator. And anytime I'm talking about dogs, it's going to go in my denominator. So for every 8 cats, there are 5 dogs. So now I can fill that into the first part of my ratio. Notice cats, there were 8 of them. So I've decided cats is going to be in my numerator, so now 8 goes in my numerator. Dogs, I've decided is going in my denominator. There were 5 dogs, right? 8 cats to 5 dogs. So 5 is in my denominator. So now I've got the first part of my ratio set up. Now I need to set up the second part of my ratio. So I know that if for every 8 cats there are 5 dogs, well, if there are 200 cats, how many dogs are there? So again, I've kept those 200 cats, I've kept in the numerator, right? And my dogs were my variable. How many dogs are there? So that's why my x is going in the denominator. And that's really why it's so important to write your ratio in English first. It's going to keep your 2 rationals, your 2 fractions, consistent. Cats should always be in the numerator and dogs should always be in the denominator. All right, and I've color-coded it to make that really clear. But if you don't write it in English first, and I've seen this happen so many times, I only point this out to you because I've seen it so frequently happen, is one of those ratios will wind up getting flipped. So instead of writing 8 over 5 equals 200 over x, somebody might write 8 over 5 equals x over 200. And that's not right. Your ratio is out of proportion now because now you've swapped dogs and cats for half the problem. So it's really important to write it in English first. And I know it sounds silly and tedious, but it will always help you to make sure that your numbers are in the right place. And so it might seem like this silly extra step, but it will make sure, it will guarantee that you get the correct answer, because if you swap one of those ratios, your answer will be wrong. The math won't turn out right. So always do your best to write your ratio in English first, okay? And don't just do your best, just always do it. It takes 2 seconds, all right? So now we have our equation here. We can move on to the third step. So now let's solve. Here's our translation, 8 over 5 equals 200 over x. We can use algebra to solve this, and the really nice thing that I notice is that I have one rational expression on one side, one rational expression on the other side of the equal sign, so I can use cross multiplication. All right, so I'm just going to multiply across my first numerator with my second denominator, 8 times x, my first denominator with my second numerator. Right, I'm just multiplying on a diagonal, basically, cross multiplying. So 8 times x equals 200 times 5, which means 8x equals 1,000. And all I need to do to solve now is divide both sides by 8, which gives me x equals 125. And always think about what that actually means. Remember, x was the number of dogs in the shelter, so that means I have 125 dogs. All right? And now let's answer. Go to the answer step. So with this step, it's always where we sort of interpret our answer, right? We got 125 dogs. And when you're doing a ratio problem, you really should stop to think about whether or not that makes sense, if that's reasonable, right? If we had gotten 2,000 dogs, we would go, it says the ratio of cats to dogs is 8 to 5, and there's 200 cats. How could we possibly have gotten more dogs, right? That wouldn't make sense. So you really want to stop to think about if your answer makes sense in terms of the ratio, if it's reasonable. And 125 dogs is pretty reasonable here. If the ratio of cats to dogs is 8 to 5, right? Well, that means that there will be a little bit more than half the amount of cats, right, of dogs. So if I have 200 cats, 125 is pretty reasonable. That's a little bit more than half. So yeah, that answer makes sense. And going back to that second step where we translated and we wrote things in English first, if I didn't write my ratio in English first and I had swapped one of those ratios, we would have gotten an answer that would have been completely unreasonable. So this step is very important. You want to make sure you take the time to think about it and interpret your answer, because if you had accidentally swapped one of your fractions, one of your ratios, it would have been completely unreasonable. And you would have realized that here and gone back and fixed that mistake. So go back to the original problem and think, what was the question asking me? Does my answer make sense? Which we just talked about. And then you should always check it. So I'm just going to plug in 125 where my x was. I reset up my ratio, plugged in 125. 8 over 5 equals 1.6, and 200 over 125 equals 1.6. So this is indeed the correct answer. And then you always want to ask yourself, what units do I need? Oh, this was 125 dogs, right? So we're dealing with dogs here. So write and mark your answer very clearly. I like to write in a sentence when I'm doing word problems, so I wrote there are 125 dogs in the shelter. Please always circle your answer so it's very clear. Okay? They're my dogs. All right, so these are the 4 steps that we use to solve every problem. Make sure you're using them. And ratio word problems really aren't that bad, right? Nice, quick, and easy cross multiplication. The real big piece is making sure that you write in English first, your ratio in English first, before you translate and stick in the numbers, all right? So have fun with these. Bye, guys.